Partitioned global address space languages have been used in many different applications. They tend to shine in programs with irregular communication patterns, irregular synchronization, and programs that leverage asynchronous operations to overlap computation with communication latency. We're going to discuss several applications that have specifically been written using UPC++. These case studies are representative of some of the different application domains and types of irregularity where UPC++ demonstrates significant productivity and performance advantages over more traditional programming models based on message passing. First, we'll talk about sparse symmetric matrix solvers written in UPC++, including a solver called SymPack. Next, we'll discuss SymCove, which is an agent-based biomedical simulation of viral progression in human lungs that have been subjected to COVID-19. And finally, we'll discuss MetaHipMer, a genome assembly application for metagenomes. We begin by looking at direct sparse solvers. Sparse matrices are matrices containing a large fraction of zero entries, and corresponding solvers take advantage of this property to reduce storage, computation, and communication. Challenges in this field include low computational intensity, irregular communication, and load imbalance. We are looking specifically at an approach known as a multi-frontal sparse solver, and its fundamental building block, the extend-add operation. More detail on this work is given in the IPDPS 19 paper referenced on this slide. In multifrontal algorithms, computations comprise a sequence of parallel operations on dense matrices called frontal matrices that correspond to a part of the entire sparse matrix. Frontal matrices are organized along the elimination tree of the sparse matrix, forming a hierarchy described in terms of a parent-child relationship representing the numerical dependencies among rows and columns during the factorization. This diagram depicts a 2D block-cyclic distribution of a fraction of the frontal matrices over a 2x3 grid of processes, as shown by the 6 colors, where each color corresponds to a different process. You can see 2 levels of such a tree in this matrix diagram, showing the parent-child relationship between the frontal matrices. We are going to focus on the data movement without attempting to explain the math. The dots in the left-hand child represent elements computed there which need to be communicated to the processes hosting the parent matrix to perform the extend-add operation, as I'll describe in more detail in the next slide. This is the critical communication step in multifrontal solvers and largely determines their performance and scalability. This communication is irregular and involves a data-dependent set of processes throughout the computation, as opposed to bulk synchronous communication steps in more traditional matrix solvers. We've written an implementation of the extend-add communication operation in UPC++ that leverages the RPC mechanism to perform this update. It's called extend-add because it's doing an addition of these matrices into the parent matrix, but also the parent is extended beyond the index space of the child. So what does the extend-add operation look like? The distribution of non-zeros in the original matrix can lead to varying sizes for the frontal matrices, and their distribution over processors can contribute to both irregularity of communication and to computational load imbalance. As the computation moves up an elimination tree from children to parents, outbound updates are binned based on the destination process. MPI implementations of extend-add typically communicate the binned updates using an MPI all-to-all V, a variable length all-to-all collective operation, which imposes some regularity on the communication at the cost of collective synchronization. There are also MPI versions that use non-blocking point-to-point communication to allow for more asynchrony and overlap. In the UPC++ implementation, updates are performed with an RPC that sends a child's updates using a UPC++ view. For instance, the red arrows in this diagram depict RPCs sending the binned updates shown by green dots to the orange and yellow processes. The RPC callback converts inbound elements from the child to the parent index space and performs the accumulation into the appropriate elements in the parent matrix. It is this extension of the child's indices into the larger index space of the parent, together with the accumulation, that gives extend-add its name. One valuable productivity feature of UPC++ RPC is that the callbacks are implicitly serialized, replacing explicit synchronization that might otherwise be required in a shared memory implementation. So what kind of performance does one see? This shows the UPC++ performance of the extend-add operation on a particular sparse matrix selected from the Sweet Sparse Matrix Collection and running on the Haswell partition of NERSC Cori supercomputer. All 3 versions of the operation are using the same frontal matrix elimination trees and data distribution, which was pre-computed. You can see that performance of the UPC++ implementation in red scales quite well up to about 1,000 processes, and then starts to level off, whereas the MPI performance degrades beyond 1,000 processes. Beyond 4 processes, the performance of the UPC++ RPC version is consistently better than the two MPI versions shown in green and blue. In the best case, UPC++ is 1.8 times faster than the MPI all-to-all V version. This figure shows the same experiments as the previous slide, run on a different partition of the same system. This is from the K&L partition of Cori, using Xeon Phi processors, also known as Knight's Landing. We see similar performance behavior here. In fact, the scaling of the UPC++ implementation is better, delivering nearly linear scaling through 2,000 processes. On this system, the maximum speedup relative to the MPI all-to-all V version was 1.6. It is worth noting that the UPC++ RPC version is about the same number of lines of code as the MPI all-to-all V version. What we've seen in the preceding slides focused on the extend-add operation in a multifrontal sparse solver. From this point forward, we are examining a full production sparse symmetric matrix solver known as SymPack and implemented in UPC++. To be clear, SymPack is a supernodal solver, not a multifrontal solver using extend-add. We don't have time to cover much detail, but this diagram depicts the task-based scheduling that forms the core of this solver, which the author refers to as a notify-get approach. The progression of the solve begins with leaf tasks producing data. Data production by one such task is step 1 and marked with 1 in a blue circle in the diagram. In step 2, the task sends a notification to the consumer of the data using RPCFF, the fire and forget variant of RPC. Rather than sending the data itself, the RPC updates the state of a task to enqueue a global pointer to the data and manages a count of available dependencies. In step 3, a task which has no remaining unavailable data dependencies is moved to the data available task list. Tasks on this list issue non-blocking rget calls, here depicted as step 4, using the global pointers enqueued by earlier RPCs. Completion of an rget updates a count of transferred dependencies. As shown in step 5, when there are no untransferred dependencies, a task moves to a ready tasks list and can proceed to generate new data, which brings one back to step 1. This approach of asynchronously managing dependencies and only fetching data on demand when it's ready to be consumed as the irregular computation unfolds was critical to avoiding memory exhaustion problems that were seen in a simpler push-based approach. This slide shows the performance of SymPack on some example matrices and compares two different algorithms for data decomposition. The matrix in this case is distributed by supernodes, which are these larger blocks of non-zeros that are in the matrix. SymPack originally used a 1D distribution, which balances the floating point operations and the memory utilization across processes very effectively, but it doesn't give very good strong scalability. The newer 2D decomposition utilizes explicit load balancing and does not rely on a static, regular, block cyclic mapping. This approach improves load balancing both in terms of memory and floating point operations and much finer grained task granularity, which leads to scalability improvement. On Cori Haswell, we see about 3 times speedup on one of the matrices called Serena, and about 2.5 times speedup on this other matrix. UPC++ enables this finer granularity task graph to be fully utilized. It simplifies building that distributed data structure directly with these global pointers and makes it easier to do the bookkeeping necessary for both the dependency calculations that drive the computational schedule and also the updates into the various sparse data structures. Here's a graph from the Cori K&L system comparing solve time on another sparse matrix. Here we compare the SymPack 1D and 2D variants and additionally the PASTIX solver, which is the state-of-art solver library written by another group that uses MPI for communication. Here we see the SymPack 2D variant represented by the red line delivers both the best scalability and the best performance at scale. This validates that the UPC++ implementation is not only delivering competitive performance, but actually outperforming PASTIX in this case by up to 85%. Here is a similar demonstration for the Cori Haswell system on another matrix, again comparing the scalability of the two SymPack variants with PASTIX. Again, we see the UPC++ based SymPAC is delivering better performance by up to about a factor of 2. UPC++ provides both productivity and performance advantages for the extend-add communication operation in multifrontal solvers and for complete solver applications such as SymPAC. The productivity comes mostly from RPC, which allows a programmer to easily express complex inter-process interactions such as the updates in the extend-add operation and the notify get state in SymPAC. Because UPC++ interoperates with MPI, it was possible to incrementally build the UPC++ version of the SymPAC solver, which originally started as an MPI code. The non-blocking APIs make it natural to express overlapped communication and asynchronous computation, such as in RPC callbacks. The reduced communication cost comes from the low overhead communication provided by the underlying Gas.ex library and enables use of fine-grained communication such as occurs in the 2D decomposition variant of SymPAC. Here the messages are much smaller than in the 1D version, and UPC++ efficiently supports such fine-grained communication events, yielding better scalability. The overlap of asynchronous communication events is managed naturally through the use of futures and callbacks. More information on SymPAC is available at the URL shown here. This next case study is a UPC++ application developed through a collaboration between Steve Hoffmeyer at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, who has led the implementation effort, and the scientific applications team led by researchers at the University of New Mexico and Arizona State University. This work was developed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think the speed of developing what is a fairly complex distributed memory application really exemplifies the productivity associated with using UPC++. First, a little bit of background here on the problem involved. As I'm sure you know, the immune response is fundamental to determining disease outcomes for patients. What you hear about mostly in the news is antibodies, and antibodies are a very important part of the immune system, but not the only part. Antibodies can only stop a virus that is outside of the host cells. Antibodies are ineffective once the virus has actually gotten inside the cell, which is what the virus needs to do in order to replicate. Inside the host cells, combating the virus is the job of the T cells, another part of the immune system. So understanding how the T cells detect and clear the virus is really critical to understanding how the disease is going to progress and whether it's going to be resolved in a particular patient. To investigate this, the SymCove application team built a 3D agent-based model in which the agents are viruses and T cells, and it's a detailed three-dimensional model of the structure of the lungs. This is a quick overview of what SymCove looks like in terms of the implementation and the goals of the project. The ultimate goal is to model the entire lung at the cellular level. This requires modeling a huge number of elements because there are about 100 billion epithelial cells lining the surfaces of the lung, and there are hundreds of millions of T cells that can respond to viral attacks. The lung itself has a very complicated branching or fractal structure, which you can see in the lower right image and is well known in terms of the structure of the lungs. What that means is that a traditional continuous style of simulation would have boundaries everywhere in the simulation. Instead, the team is using an agent-based simulation. The time resolution is in minutes, but the goal is to simulate an entire lung for 20 to 30 days so that you can really look at the progression of a patient over a period of time during the illness. SymCove is written in UPC++, and it uses a distributed 3D spatial grid. The particles, which are the agents in the simulation, such as the T cells, move over time, and the computation, once they've moved into their position, is localized on a given processor. The load balancing is very tricky because of the movement of the particles. There's a lot of activity near an infection if the infection just starts in a particular part of the lung and then spreads out. The infection locations can spread and move over time, and new areas can erupt, which greatly complicates the load balancing requirements. There is a heavy use of RPCs in this application. As an agent moves between domains, it's easy to accomplish that movement with RPC and then to have the other processor that receives that agent to pick it up and perform the computation on it. It was very easy to develop the first prototype of this, and it produces fairly good distributed memory performance that avoids a lot of synchronization using the same semantics of RPCs that we've already talked about, namely that when one of the RPCs is executing on the remote side, you don't have to worry about synchronizing with other threads within that particular rank. And there's extensive support then for asynchrony that improves the overlap of communication and computation. This is what some of the main components look like in the simulation. These are the different types of agents that you see on the left-hand side, such as viruses, the epithelial cells, then you see the T cells, and so on. Each of these has a state machine describing its behavior. For example, a healthy cell that is infected transitions into one that's incubating the virus, into expressing the virus, and then being triggered by a T cell to become apoptotic, which is a form of programmed cell death that prevents the cell from producing any more virus. Without reading through all of the details of this, you can see a complicated control pattern and how this computation behaves depending on whether there's a virus in that particular region of the lung and where the T cells are in terms of attacking the virus in the cells and so on. One of the other complications in this code is its dependence on observational data, which is being used in 3 different ways. First, to figure out the parameters of the model, such as the rate of viral production by the infected cells. When the virus replicates inside the host cells, it takes advantage of mechanisms in the cell to reproduce itself, and exactly how that works differs by disease. Second, in order to validate the model, simulations are run and the output compared against observations from actual COVID-19 infected patients. These can include viral load measurements and imaging data, such as the CT scan of an infected lung, shown here. Third, observational data can be used to seed the model. That is, what's a reasonable starting point? What is the spatial distribution of the infection? So you're also looking at these patients to try to determine what does a typical load look like as the disease is just starting to form in the body. This figure, taken from the paper cited at the bottom, shows the quality of results of the SimCove simulation code. As mentioned in the previous slide, observational data is used to determine model parameters. These results show how, when using just 4 such parameters, the SimCove predictions of viral load shown by the orange curves can match the data shown with the red dots, taken from 8 different patients. As the paper describes, the mathematical measures of goodness of fit for the SimCove simulation are similar to those of competing models, shown by the gray curves. Additionally, the SimCove prediction of an earlier rise and more prolonged period at the peak level of viral load is consistent with the observations that the virus is most contagious early in the infection, prior to the onset of symptoms, when, almost by definition, there is no observational data to fit. The competing models are based on ODEs, and although they can match temporal distributions of viral load, they are unable to capture spatial aspects of the disease. This last slide is going to show visualization from an early prototype of this application. This is just a 3-dimensional cube with one small portion of the lung in it. So this is not looking at the whole lung. You are seeing the virus spread, and in this case, you'll see it now sort of oscillate as the viral load and the T cells are working against each other, and then now getting to the edges of the simulation boundary. I think this is a very exciting use of UPC++ to solve a timely and critical problem and to really understand the immune response to COVID-19.